Rhett McLaughlin and Alex O'Connor recently had a discussion where Rhett outlined 3 things that Christians need to come to terms with, and the second was the reality of evolution. And on that point, Rhett is absolutely correct. Hey everyone, I'm Brad. I'm a PhD candidate, and on this channel, I explore the fascinating world of mythology as it relates to the biblical text. And in this video, rather than rehashing the scientific data, which isn't my field anyway, I want to look at something most responses on this video completely ignored. And that was the biblical text itself. Because when you actually examine the biblical data on its own terms, what you will find is surprising. And that is that the strongest case for accepting evolution and simultaneously rejecting the idea that the Bible was ever meant to be a scientific textbook doesn't come from science, but from the biblical text itself. Now, when you or I or most people hear the word mythology, the first thing that comes to our minds is creation stories. Those fantastic accounts of either the origin of the cosmos, the origin of humanity, or both. And in Genesis 1, we find each of these narratives together, when humanity is presented as the climactic culmination of a carefully structured cosmic creation. And it's contained within the first poem within the Hebrew Bible. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, believe it or not, this is the verse that people who view Genesis as a scientific account of the creation of humanity are going to point to. And specifically, they're going to argue that this is Adam, who doesn't show up until Genesis 2. And the vast majority of people that are going to fall in this camp are the young earth creationist crowd. And this is the view that the days in Genesis 1 are consecutive 24-hour periods of time, and therefore the earth and the universe is 6 to 10,000 years old. Now, the 4,000-year range there is due to the interpretation of the genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. But regardless of that gap, you can see the issue here in regards to young earth creationism, and that is that 6 to 10,000 years is nowhere near enough time for evolution to take place. So according to this view, evolution is not possible if you take the Bible as a scientific textbook. But as I previously stated, there is a major issue with this, and that is the biblical text itself. So let's examine Genesis 1:27. You can see I've got everything color-coded here to match, as well as some asterisk points. And this first segment says, "So God created man in his own image." And you'll notice that I have a single asterisk by the word man. And that is because in the Hebrew text, this is the word ha-adam. And I've got this color-coded again here. What you see in green is the. It's the prefix to the word Adam, which is where we get the name Adam from, which is why some, again, are going to view this as Adam. But Adam simply means man. And so when you have that the in front of it, it is the man, or the human, or humanity. And Hebrew works just the way English does. You don't fix the definite article the to a proper name. I am not the Brad, you are not the Jeff, you are not the Mary. So this is not a reference to Adam, this is a reference to all of humanity. So what this means is that Genesis 1 is actually speaking about the creation of all humanity, whereas Genesis 2 is the account of Adam and ultimately Eve. Now, where this gets a little bit confusing in English is this second line here. In the image of God, he created him. You might be thinking, well, him, obviously that's a single man person. But in the Hebrew, him is masculine because of grammar. But it describes humanity as both male and female, and that's indicated in this third line where it states male and female, he created them. So according to the Hebrew text, this is a reference to humanity. This is not a reference to a single man or Adam. And this is a major blow to young earth creationism, as well as the view that Adam shows up in Genesis 1. He simply does not, according to the text. Now, the other aspect of this is what you see in blue, the word image. And this is because we in our culture view image as in the appearance of something. And this is exactly how the young earth creationism interpretation works on this as well. It is evolution can't be true. People could not have evolved from an ape-like ancestor because people in their current form were created in the appearance of God. But just like ha-adam, there's a textual issue with this as well. And so we'll look at this word in the Hebrew as well, this word in the image, or more literally in image. you actually have three occurrences of this word ṣelem here within a couple verses. And it has to do with our image and his image, which his image is the image of God. And then just ṣelem, which is what we see right here, which is just in image. I have the in there because in English we have to put a the. But what you see in green is the Hebrew letter bet. What you see in orange is the Hebrew word ṣelem. And ṣelem literally means statue. So a little bit different meaning than what we view as our image, but that's not the issue here. The issue is that green letter bet. Because in Hebrew, this is known by several different names, but within the literature that I've read, the bet of predication is what it's called most often. And this bet of predication denotes role or function. It is not about appearance. And so when we see this imagery language show up in Genesis 1 3 different times, where it states in our image, in his image, again, in the image of God, each of these occurrences uses that in, or the preposition in, which should be understood as meaning as, or in the capacity of. And so really the best way to view this word image here is thinking of it like a verb. And that's something I first heard from the late and great biblical scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. But if you view it here as a verb, that you are imaging something, you could say the meaning of this bet is that humanity was created as the image of God. Humans are created as God's imagers. They function in the capacity of God's representatives. And so the image of God is not a quality within human beings. Rather, it is what human beings are. And just as a side note here, that throughout the ancient Near East, it was only kings who were made in the image of God. And the one exception to this really is a second millennium Egyptian text known as the Instruction of Merikari, in which we find something similar to what we see here in Genesis, that all humanity is created in the image of God. And we can see this same function language carry over later on in Genesis, when in Genesis 9 verse 6, it said, "For God made man in his own image." And this passage is actually sandwiched between two instances of the command to be fruitful and multiply. That's Genesis 9:1 and Genesis 9:7. But this imaging vocabulary is linked to childbearing. And therefore, if you want to think about it in terms of humanity being created in Genesis 1, or even Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, humans after all of those characters are created are not direct creations of God. But here in Genesis 9 verse 6, it recognizes these later human beings as the image of God. So again, it's not appearance, it's function. And another important piece of evidence on this is that the literary symmetry of Genesis 1, 26 through 28 invites the reader to compare corresponding sections. And so what we see here is that the image of God statements are immediately followed by sections that unpack the meaning and the significance of the divine image. And without going on a total grammar spiel here, what you have going on here is that when you have a verb of command followed by a clause that also has a verb of command, and this is known as a jussive, it is meant to be understood as a purpose statement. So you have, let us make humanity in our image in order that they may rule. In other words, the purpose of creating humanity in our image, using the language from Genesis 1, is so that humanity may rule. And this rulership plays directly into the biblical theme of humanity acting as a royal priesthood, who functions as rulers over the cosmic creation as the representatives of the very first character that you meet within the biblical text. That is the supreme deity, the divine being. It is the God of the Hebrew Bible, who will later become known as Adonai. And the takeaway from this, and it's something that Rhett hit heavily on in his discussion with Alex, is that faith in Christianity and accepting the truth of science do not have to compete against one another, because storytelling is the history of humanity, and stories are what we find all throughout the biblical text. But science is the history and the ongoing process of discovery. So let's continue to tell stories, to examine these stories we find within the biblical text, within the ancient Near East, within the Greek literature, while at the same time seeking to discover more about this world and this universe that we all share together. But hey, I want to know your thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe. And if you enjoyed this, you'll enjoy my other videos that I've done dissecting Genesis 1. Thank you all so much, and I will see you on the next video.